Harvey is just
Yeah.
unmuting himself.
I'm sorry about that. Well, here we go. Martin, it's great to see you. Thanks, Jane, for handing over to me. I'm just going to make a very few points at the start. The first is to say that we are trying to incorporate in the annual series, which Catherine organises, a local society to mount one of the presentations each season. Last year it was Haydas. I see that the Haydas speaker last year is in the audience, and tonight it's Enfield Archaeological Society and Martin Dearne. Now, Enfield Archaeological Society was formed after the war. It's been a very, very active local society. It still continues to be so. And I suppose if I was to pick two areas of activity which I very much associate with Enfield. Martin will correct me if I get it wrong. But firstly, work on the Roman sites relating to Ermine Street, which runs north from London towards Lincoln through the borough. And also, of course, on the subject which we're dealing with tonight, or at least one aspect of what we're dealing with tonight, which is the major houses and palaces which characterize the area in the medieval and Tudor period. Now, Martin has chosen to talk about the work the society has been doing at Elsyng. I think Elsyng is, as a house, is usually considered to be the greatest of the Elsyng houses. It's, of course, associated principally with Tudors. I mean, we can associate Henry VIII with it when he took it off his speaker in the House of Commons, and we can associate his regal children with it. First of all, Edward, then Mary, and then Elizabeth. But to talk about the work that's been done to try and locate elements of the palace and try and find out more about it, it's a great pleasure for me to hand over to Martin to do the talk this evening. So Martin, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Harvey. I shall just start sharing my screen. So just a moment while I get that running. As you say, Harvey, we have been working at Elsyng. I hope you can now all see my screen.
Yep, well, I can.
Jolly good. Okay. Well, thanks very much for asking me to speak tonight about the Enfield Archaeological Society and its work for the last, so far, 18 years at Elsyng Palace. The society has been going since the 1950s, as Harvey mentioned. And, well, when there isn't a pandemic, we excavate on this site for 2 weeks every summer. I'll concentrate on Elsyng tonight, but the society, as well as that, is very active in the community generally. We have a program of lectures, if currently, like La Masse, of course, online. We have outreach events, especially during the excavations at Elsyng, and we also have a successful program of schools outreach programs. I'm just showing here a report on one we did in 2020 during the pandemic, partly done through Zoom with schools based on finds from a site at Alderney Park in Enfield. In addition, we undertake actually quite a large proportion of the rest of the archaeology that's done in the London Borough of Enfield, sometimes also in adjoining areas out into Hertfordshire. Elsyng is one of 3 scheduled ancient monuments we've worked on, the others being Theobald's Palace in Cheshunt and an Iron Age hill fort, which is perhaps not very well known, at Bush Hill Park Golf Course in Enfield. But a major focus of our work since the 60s has been dozens of large and small sites we've excavated, sometimes alongside commercial archaeology units such as Mola, in the first Roman roadside settlement north of Londinium on Elsyng's on Ermine Street. Again, that's at Bush Hill Park, which is a a section, as it were, of Enfield. We've also worked on another Roman settlement you perhaps won't have heard of, a small settlement called Church Fields in Edmonton, which is in the southern part of the borough. As medieval, Tudor and Roman periods, we've got members with expertise in LIDAR, in Pleistocene and prehistoric archaeology, in archaeozoology, and the archaeology of World War II, all amongst a team who advise the borough on infrastructure projects, increasing numbers of wetland and flood alleviation schemes in parks and open spaces especially. And that team, which includes current and retired professional archaeologists, undertake the necessary excavations and watching briefs from the borough ahead. For instance, we've recorded 4 very large World War II public air raid shelters in the last few years. We've recorded the gardens of Gough House, which belonged to the noted antiquary Richard Gough, and most recently, a whole Pleistocene and early Holocene landscape on the Lee Valley Gravels. And I'm showing here just a selection of some of the work we've done. But to turn to the main subject tonight, Elsyng Palace, this is where we are in what was once rural Middlesex, but now, of course, is in the north of Greater London. Elsyng is in the north of the borough. It's on fairly flat land near to a tributary of the River Lee called Maiden's Brook. The palace site is now covered by trees, which includes a double tree avenue planted after it was demolished by the owners of the standing 40 Hall, which is on a hill above the palace. And there's a system of lakes near to the palace, which you can see top left, that may well originate possibly as medieval fish ponds and likely then as water gardens associated with the palace. The whole estate that the palace lies in is a public park, with the hall that the park's attached to recently returned to much of its 17th century form, and the estate improved in 2 national lottery funded projects, which we were the archaeological contractors on. And I need to thank the borough and its museum service, who've been our partners in that work and the work I'll talk about tonight, as well as Historic England, or English Heritage as it was, for permitting and supporting the work, Elsyng being a scheduled ancient monument. I'm going to start with a sort of potted history of the site, which just summarises what many years of documentary research has revealed. So we've got a small amount of pottery and some pen tiles that suggest there's some sort of house here as early as the 11th or 12th century. But it's really Lord John Tiptoft and his son John Tiptoft, Earl of Worcester, in the 1430s and later, that we think built the first substantial house. We don't have that many archaeological traces of it as yet, but it was probably a very early brick-built house around 2 courtyards, and served these 2 wealthy men who were very heavily involved in government at the time. Presumably, they would want a prestigious house within striking distance of London, whereas the family actually originates in Cambridgeshire. The most visible evidence we've got of their presence in Enfield is the memorial to Joyce, wife of Lord John and mother of the Earl, in the local parish church. But the most important early owner was Sir Thomas Lovell. Sir Thomas Lovell gained control of the house about 1486 by having his new wife's brother, who'd inherited it, declared insane and himself made custodian of his vast estates, including the one Elsyng sat in. Now, one can't prove it, but it looks very much like Lovell may well have at the very least taken advantage of the circumstances and may even have deliberately engineered all this. Lovell's a lawyer. He comes from a really quite unimportant, very minor gentry family from Norfolk, but he had this meteoric rise under Henry VII and became one of a sort of new breed of Tudor administrators who Henry VII relied on to run the country and exact the maximum income from it. And he went on to serve Henry VIII in his early years. He even appears very briefly in Shakespeare's Henry VIII. He was Chancellor of the Exchequer, Speaker of the House of Commons, Constable of the Tower of London, amongst many, many other roles. And at different points in his career, he was responsible for many different aspects of the government of Britain. Elsyng was the largest of three main homes he had. He had one smaller home in Norfolk, where he originated from, and he also kept a large house at Holywell Priory, subject of significant excavations recently, of course. We're pretty sure he remodeled the inner court of Elsyng to make it fit for kings to visit, and both Henry VII and Henry VIII did come and visit him for protracted periods over many, many years and many times. And most of our work has been focused on the southwest side of the outer court of the house, which is an area of the palace that we think he also completely rebuilt. Now, he died in 1954 and left us an invaluable inventory of the house. And it was inherited by his great nephew by marriage, a man called Thomas Manners, who soon after was created Earl of Rutland. The Earl of Rutland was one of Henry VIII's close circle of jousting friends at court. And because of the survival of many of his household papers, we can paint a fairly detailed picture of life at Elsyng in the last days of Lovell and under Rutland, plus his wife and several children. In 1539, though, Henry VIII made a deal with them to exchange Elsyng, which he wanted for himself, for two dissolved monasteries in northern England, including Rivelour, and it becomes a minor royal palace. It's one of the number of palaces the infant Edward VI and his sisters moved around. It saw, therefore, periodic use of the royal family. Now, Henry's main interest in it may actually have been a hunting base, because it was near the hunting forest of Enfield Chase. And he probably actually created another small hunting forest called New Park around it. The only incident of national import to happen connected to the royal family at Elsyng was when Edward VI was told, along with Princess Elizabeth, that his father was dead and he was king in 1546. That happened at Elsyng. He'd been brought from Hertford, thinking he was going to be made Prince of Wales, towards London, and his uncle couldn't really keep that up. His uncle was attempting to make sure he would become the protector of the king. He couldn't keep that up until he got to London, so they stopped at Elsyng, where Elizabeth was living, and he was told then that his father was dead and he was king. But Elsyng itself was given to his sister Elizabeth in her father's will, and she clearly stayed there for periods during the reigns of Edward and his half-sister Mary. and it's possible that Edward paid to have work done on it, but it only really came back into use by the monarch when Elizabeth became queen. So for a while, it's used as a stopping place on progresses north of London by Elizabeth, such as one in 1561 through Essex. But there are hints in the sources that it may have been in a bit of a decline later in her reign, and it may well be that it was a hunting lodge in its grounds that continued to be of particular use to the monarch. James I used it too before he acquired Theobald's Palace a little bit further north. Um, but it looks like in the last days of Elizabeth, and then more so during the reign of James, the palace was actually let out to senior courtiers. Certainly, James, who at one point was about to demolish the palace before he changed his mind and had it partly rebuilt and refurbished, seems to have had little use for it after about 1610. And he therefore allowed one of his favourites, Philip Herbert, and his family to live there. Herbert inherited considerably more wealth in 1630 when his brother died, and even he moved to his family's main home at Wilton House in Wiltshire. For reasons that are not quite clear, he did buy Elsyng from the new king, Charles I, on the eve of the English Civil War, and just before he fell out with him, in fact. But it seems to have been rather neglected, except perhaps for ornamental gardens around it. And eventually, after his death, it was bought by the owner of the much smaller Forty Hall, which stood on the palace above it and had since 1629. And as far as we know, at this juncture, when it's acquired by Nicholas Hinton, who owns Forty Hall, it was demolished in about 1657, 1660. That's the historical story of Elsyng Palace. The archaeological story starts in 1963, when the EAS relocated its site and over 3 years uncovered very well preserved remains of a range, including 2 towers, that we now understand was in the inner court of the palace, probably part of the royal apartments created by Lovell, if reusing some of the structure of Tiptoft's house. And this at the bottom is the interior of the larger tower, which late in the life of the palace seems to have become a stair tower and ultimately became a rubbish dump. The rubbish including, you can just about pick them out, the carcasses of a dog and a deer. Now, the main slide here shows the pattern excavations that we've undertaken over the years. Most of the 1960s work is that block over on the left-hand side, whereas the scatter of trenches, if we can call it that, labelled as the Southwest Range, is where the majority of the modern work has been focused. But in between the research work of the 1960s and the modern work that we've been taking is sandwiched an unfortunate incident in 1967, which you can see up on the top left-hand side. In 1967, a chunk of the palace was actually destroyed by a new orbital gas main. Now, there was hurried recording, as it was by then a scheduled monument, but unfortunately, at the time, nobody knew quite exactly how far the palace extended, and the very large trench for the new gas pipeline actually cut a swathe through what we now understand to be part of the early moat at the north side of the palace, removing evidence for probably 3 successive phases of building work, which it's actually taken many, many years to sort out the records of. And I should just credit here Drury, who's made a significant contribution to sorting out those records. By the time we started looking at the palace again in 2004, much of the 1960s site had actually become quite wooded. Besides, the priority appeared to be to try and define the palace's basic limits and its basic plan. But we also had to respond to threats posed by replanting applications in the Lime Tree Avenue. You can see the Lime Tree Avenue as the two, or rather four lines of green dots crossing the screen from top to bottom. And some of the trenches marked with a P suffix or prefix are those points where we excavated in advance of tree planting or to evaluate whether tree planting would be safe given the archaeological remains. So these widely spread trenches are partly a response to threats to the site, partly in order to try and define the limits of the site before we actually started focusing on one particular area, which eventually we did. And that area was the southwest range of the outer court at the bottom of the screen. Once we did, we had some help from aerial photographs, and we've used LiDAR extensively, which has aided targeting trenches. But it's a very annoying thing about the site that there are intermittent gravel outcrops poking through the brick earth, which is the main subsoil. And when the palace was demolished, the brick rubble was spread wide around the site, and then it was selectively re-landscaped with gravel, all of which makes conventional geophys next to useless. So the result of a lot of pits and careful scrutiny of documentary records is this plan, which shows the palace probably from the beginning to have featured two courts, separated by a four-story gatehouse, marked here as the inner gatehouse, with the inner court containing a great hall, certainly, the royal apartments, a large chapel, and the kitchen complex, amongst other buildings, while the outer was certainly defined by stables, stores, service quarters, and other service ranges. And it's one of those, the Southwest Range marked here, that we've focused on for the last 18 years. So we had also established just how shallowly buried many of the remains of the palace were and how well preserved. And I'll just show here one or two examples. And we are beginning, it's taken a time, to get an idea of the phasing of the site, which relies largely on the different mortars in use. In particular, something like the 15th century drain I'm showing bottom left uses a rather soft sandy yellow mortar, whereas everything built by Lovell onwards uses a much harder white mortar. So we began to concentrate on this one range of the outer court on its southwest side. There's not a lot in this area of the early palace, the house built by the Tiptofts. We've got robber trenches for a curtain wall with a bastion marked 1359 if you look to the right of this slide. And we've got a drain that stayed in use for the lifetime of the building, as most of them seem to have done, and just a couple of walls in the centre there marked 1845 and 1737. But that's about all that seems so far to have survived from the early house of the Tiptofts, because this area was completely remodelled by Lovell. That remodelling created a new range, which seems to have included adjuncts to the main kitchens, and as it ran east, stables, stores, certainly a huge barn, with an open courtyard to one side, and other buildings we haven't quite established the function of yet. So this is the plan of that range, probably continuing off to the top right to become the gatehouse range, and with the facade wall of the range lost to truncation, lower right where the large T-shaped trench is marked in brown. As you can see, we have at least 9 ground floor rooms behind that facade wall and fronted by a double moat into which the garderobe chute and a second next bit, which is a later addition, fed. In fact, moats, a shallow decorative outer one and a functional deep inner one, and the garderobes were excavated early in establishing the limits of the palace complex in this direction. One of them was especially interesting, as someone had stood over it when the palace was demolished to disassemble a window and recover the lead holding the glass in place, discarding the glass into the chute, but also dropping one of the complete quarries or window panels still held in by its leads or cames. And as extracted by our chief surveyor, who fortunately has very long arms, this is that rare survival, a complete quarrel still in its leads. Inside the building, we had at the west end 3 rooms. So rooms 1, 2, and 3. Room 3, very large, gravel and chalk floored, a brick water channel along its north side, and with a stairwell between it and room 2, which had had a glazed brick floor, though it was pretty much gone by the time we got there. We strongly suspect these rooms are associated with the kitchens in some way, perhaps ground floor rooms of an obviously 2-story block used by senior kitchen officials who lived over them, maybe subsidiary larders, pantries or sculleries. In fact, some quite large flagons were smashed in situ in room 3 when the palace was demolished, which may well be significant. Certainly as we move east, the kitchen associations become clear, as we'll see shortly. But we couldn't do much with rooms 4 and 8 because a large tree stood here, and the parts department, who have charge of the site, don't really like you sawing down their trees. But even just deturfing around the tree revealed the footings of this multi-angular tower that had probably been added to the facade wall at some point, probably in the 16th century, and perhaps replacing an earlier one of which there was just a small trace. Rooms 6, though, their east ends lost, were another matter. To start with, until late in the life of the palace, when alterations to the plan of this part of range had occurred, and a gravel and chalk floor had replaced them, we found these 2 rooms had had a sequence of patterned brick floors laying one on top of another. I'm showing here 2 phases of what were several phases from room 6. And here we have some more exposures. Amongst the tree roots, we've got just one phase of the floor of room 6 at the top, although, as you can see, they laid it in many different patterns, and below a photo mosaic showing fragments of 3 of what were 4 phases of brick floors in this room, largely revealed by later truncations through them, because it being a scheduled ancient monument, we didn't remove any of the structural flaws. We did see quite a lot more of these floors. Here in room 5, for instance, we have 2 phases of a floor. There's quite a lot of demolition damage here, but the brick floors were both again patterned. It's not that clear to see on this slide, I know, but take my word for it, they were quite elaborately patterned, particularly the later one at the top. Room 5, we believe to be the palace boiling house, and its southern part was sunken to accommodate this large furnace. And we assume the large boiling vat will have sat on top of that to boil large joints and make stocks. Its associated ash pit had overflown by the time it went out of use, perhaps before the rest of the palace. But repairs showed that this furnace had functioned over a considerable period, perhaps having replaced an earlier furnace either in the late 15th or earlier 16th century. And there are also beam settings in the face of the furnace, which suggest there was a superstructure above it, probably to facilitate the raising and lowering of large meat joints into the boiling vat. And this is how we think this superstructure may have looked and how the furnace may have been used. Opposite the furnace, there was a brick-built cupboard, probably for fuel storage. But the reason I show the slide top left is to emphasize some of the difficulties of excavating on this site, because these rooms are slap bang on the line of one of the later tree avenues crossing the site. And what we have to do is to carefully excavate around major tree root networks and then backfill so the trees are not damaged. Beyond rooms 5 and 6, we seem to move out of kitchen-related areas and probably into ground floor stables below storage rooms. This may also be where the palace's water supply entered. The water supply was drawn in lead pipes down from springs on the hill above the site, which has got a perched water table. Now, successive floors in this room were just of rammed pebbles, and truncation during demolition was widespread here. But a sunken brick floor survived in front of the setting for probably a circular cistern at one end of the room. Then to the north of rooms 6 and 9, we have this very large barn. It's a barn that's probably referred to in some of the repair accounts for the palace from the 1540s, which make us fairly confident that it was built by Sir Thomas Lovell and probably repaired many times. It was presumably the main hay store for the palace, possibly a more general food store as well. Like pretty much all of this range, except for the facade wall, which was brick built, these buildings were constructed of timber on dwarf brick walls, usually something like 4 to 8 course high. You can see one at the bottom of the slide, in fact, crossing one of the points where Lovell had demolished the perimeter wall of Tiptoft's palace in order to construct his new range, and the fill of the robber trench had gradually sunken, causing the wall to sink as well. In fact, at this point, there was evidence that they'd had to dig up the floor inside the building in order to actually patch that area so that there wasn't a large hole, which presumably rats could get through, into the main buildings. The barn was flanked to one side, to the right on the plan, by what seems to have been an open courtyard, presumably a courtyard that would have allowed wagons to pull up next to one of the main entrances to the barn, which is in the wall that divides the barn from the courtyard, so that they could be emptied out. The main sort of structural feature found here was that large block of stone top left, which seems to probably have been the setting for one of a number of posts that would have run from top to bottom of the courtyard, forming a veranda in advance of the side of the barn. This is one of the very few pieces, in fact, of originally worked stone that we have found during the excavations, because during demolition, the palace was clearly completely ransacked for anything worth salvaging and selling off. But this piece of stone, which must originally have been in Tiptoft's palace, had been repurposed as a post pad when we found it. Next to that is an area that we refer to as the trapezoidal structure. It seems to have actually been left standing during part of the demolition works, maybe even for the demolition crew to live in, and therefore looks, when it's excavated, a freestanding building, but actually it's part of a wider range, much of which was very, very heavily truncated during demolition. It's got some quite interesting features in it, which makes it a little bit of a mystery. It's got a narrow sort of corridor at one end, probably the base of a chimney attached to that side. Parts of it have got rammed chalk floors, other parts gravel or earth floors. And there's this horseshoe-shaped brick setting. It's not a furnace, there are no signs of burning on it, but it seems to be for something like maybe a large storage barrel. And the northern room in this area also had one of the few good occupation deposits found. So that late in the life of the palace anyway, it may well have been servants' accommodation. Overall then, what we have is a range of the outer court that at one end was almost an overflow of the kitchens, which will have been mainly in the inner court, but also incorporated large storage and stabling areas and a large barn. These aren't, of course, the grand spaces of the palace. They're not the rooms Henry VIII would ever have walked through. They're part of the engine room that ran the palace. This was the world of the stable lads, the garner men, the spit turners, the furnace stokers, the sauce makers, and the ham boilers, who underpinned the conspicuous consumption that Lovell, Rutland, and later the royal court, including Henry VIII, would expect to encounter in their palace. That's underlined by the finds from the site. Until the early 17th century, when some rubbish middens did begin to develop, the palace had been kept very clean. And most finds have come from the demolition rubble. And even that, as I say, has clearly been picked clean of anything reusable or resaleable, down to almost every complete brick. We have about 5 complete bricks from the entire site. We do have are a few finer items, particularly this moulded brick top left, which is moulded with what is supposed to be Lovell's personal symbol of a falcon's wing. It does look suspiciously like a chicken drumstick, though, and it's known to us as the chicken brick. We've also got a lead angel's head. We suspect it's an ornament that would have been gilded and attached to a wooden ceiling. And we've got a few personal finds, including the plate from one of these large chain office that one sees in Tudor portraits of important people, though this is just a copper alloy one. Perhaps it was originally gilded. One suspects it probably belonged to a household officer more than an aristocrat, but presumably the other find on this slide, this gold hat decoration, which is tiny, it has to be said. It's only a few millimeters long, although it's fantastically well worked, presumably belonged to somebody of much higher status. But most finds are utilitarian in nature. They're dominated by kitchen pottery, large flagons, and salt glazed stoneware jugs. So we've got a nice selection, for instance, of these often made up of arms and so-called beardman faces that decorated the Frechen Bachmann ware that wine and beer was stored and served in. And some more decorative 17th century Delft ware. What emerges is, though, mainly the rubbish from a working kitchen. Things like a great deal of butchered bone and cauldron-sized cooking pots. So Elsyng was a prestige home. Indeed, later in its life, it was a royal palace. It was meant to impress, as this reconstruction of it suggests. But what we've been looking at is the infrastructure that let it perform that role. The bits of the palace nobody but the servants saw, that didn't get included in the written accounts of its magnificence and weren't hung with tapestries. The bits of it we too easily forget. Most people who lived in a Tudor palace actually knew, because that is where they worked. And COVID notwithstanding, we managed to restart excavations after a year away from them late this summer, moving on to the next phase, which will be to explore the inner gatehouse, which we know separated the inner and outer courts and provided a lot of the higher status accommodation in the palace. And we've probably got the first evidence of it in the form of a very large robber trench. But post-excavation, including reassembling all these lovely sherds of a single Delft drug jar, is ongoing, so that'll have to be a story for another time. Finally then, thank you for listening tonight. If you're interested in knowing more about Elsyng, had it not been for the pandemic, we would already have finished and published a major monograph on the site and the lives of those who lived there. But I'm pleased to say we've just secured a substantial amount of Heritage Lottery Fund support, a range of schools and public outreach projects to be linked to excavations in 2022, which should also ensure that this book will appear sometime next year, and it will complement these other volumes we've already published that explore different periods in the history of the London Borough of Enfield. And for more information on the Enfield Archaeological Society, including past day-by-day excavation blogs and documents relating to the palace, do please look at our website, the address of which is here. But for now, I'll just say that if there are any questions, I'll do my best to answer them, and I'll hand back to Harvey.
Very much, Martin. There was a tremendous illustration, I think, of the strength of those places. The amount of brickwork you've uncovered in the years is quite amazing. And I mean, I'll hand you over to Jane for questions at the moment, but can I ask one about Lovell? I mean, was he the Lovell who featured in Richard III? Remember, Shakespeare the cat, Ratcliffe the rat, and Lovell the dog, all united for Richard the Hog? And if so, did he change sides pretty quickly once Richard was got rid of by the young Henry VII?
No, I'm afraid this is a popular misconception. In fact, there are about 4 aristocratic Lovell families in Britain at the time. And the Lovell who was at Elsyng came from a different one. Viscount Lovell, who you're talking about, came from a family that was actually on the opposite side from the Lovell this family, this Lovell was on. And this Lovell was actually given the other Lovell's properties when they were confiscated from him.
Okay.
which is a nice irony.
Indeed. Thank you. Let me hand back to Jane for the questions, and I'll come back a bit later. Jane, over to you, please.
Right. Well, we have a few coming through, but I'm going to abuse my position and ask, what did a Ghana man do?
Okay, a Ghana man is essentially the member of staff who quality controls the food and supplies coming into the house. Particularly is in the early period, it's particularly associated with checking the quality of grain, but later on he comes to sort of be a quality control man for the supplies to the kitchens.
Brilliant. Great. Thank you for that. Karen would like to know where the name Elsyng comes from.
Okay, it comes from North Norfolk. There's a village called Elsyng in North Norfolk, and from there derived a family called the De Elsyngs, who were mercers, cloth merchants in the city of London. And their first representative we can trace in Enfield is a man called Jordan de Elsyng, who was a mercer and a cheese merchant. And he and some of his family, in particular probably his great nephew, formed the early land holdings of what became the Manor of Elsyng. Unfortunately, the Manor of Elsyng, when we get later into historical times, isn't where Elsyng Palace is. It's on the other side of the borough. What seems to have happened is that the name stuck, but the piece of land that Elsyng was built on, Elsyng Palace, was actually acquired by a different manor, which eventually became the Manor of Worcester's, whereas Elsyng Manor sort of divested itself of the holdings around Elsyng Palace and moved to the other side of the borough. But ultimately then it comes from a personal name in North Norfolk.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. Hugh wants to ask, was there any chance to do archaeomagnetic dating, for instance, from the fire areas?
No, unfortunately not. There wasn't anything that would have been susceptible to that. We did look at it when we were excavating in 2005, a site I didn't show you, which is actually part of a brick clamp. We found, which is relatively unusual, an area where they'd been burning bricks in order to probably affect repairs to the palace. This is some way off along the approach road to the palace. And we did have someone come and look and see whether that would be suitable for archaeomagnetic dating, but unfortunately it wasn't. So not yet, but if we find anywhere else that is, we will do it.
Brilliant, great. That was for Hugh. Now, Chris has offered a comment rather than a question on so many floor repairs. Is it particularly, do you think, unexpected amount of floor repairs?
I don't think it's unexpected given the amount of time we're looking at. We're looking at the first floors being laid probably about 1486, and the last ones I suspect somewhere in about 1620. So I don't think that's unexpected. What I did find a little unexpected was the fact that they didn't bother taking up any of the old floors. They just put new ones on top, to the extent that where an area of the older floor was completely useless and it had become almost a pit, they just filled it in and then stuck a new floor over the top. I don't know if you could see on some of the slides, but some of them are quite badly slumped. And I suspect that's got something to do with that perhaps slightly slipshod preparation that was done.
Another question from Mark. Was there a salvage deal done at the point of demolition as the site is so clean?
I think there must have been, yes. We haven't established any, sort of actual documentary record of that. In fact, the documentary record for Elsyng is very, very good up until sort of the early 17th century, and then it completely falls off a cliff. We're not even absolutely sure who it was that Nicholas Rainton, who owned Forty Hall, bought it from. We've got two possible candidates. Once it goes out of royal hands, we just don't get any documentary evidence. But the rubble, there's lots of rubble, has clearly been picked clean. We've only found complete roofing tiles in one or two instances where they've clearly slipped down from a roof that's being taken down and then have been covered immediately by broken bricks. We've got hardly any complete bricks. We've got no complete floor tiles, even though we've got lots and lots of fragments. We've got almost no work stone, except the sort of little bits that get knocked off when you're sort of reshaping a block ready for use. We've got lots of evidence for them actually taking the lead from the windows and re-smelting it on site. I didn't have time to show, but actually in the excavations this year, we've had what we call a half bottom, a little sort of plano-convex ingot of lead, surrounded by lots and lots of little solidified splashes, clearly where they are taking the window leads, melting them down on site into ingots and taking them away. So yes, I think this is architectural salvage on a huge scale.
Another question from Catherine. Where are the finds displayed?
Right, there's a small display in Forty Hall, and there's a small display, or there was a small display in the civic centre known as Thomas Hardy House in the centre of Enfield, which you can't see at the moment, unfortunately, because it turned into a vaccination centre and is now closed for renovation because some of the borough's functions are moving around. All the finds are obviously in a museum. They're in Enfield Museum. And as I say, there is a small display actually in Forty Hall itself on the top of the hill above. We hope that as we come out of COVID and the museum, which is currently being relocated, is sort of worked on, that we will be able to display more. But they will all be published as well in the forthcoming monograph.
We have no further questions. So unless any come in now, I think I will. Oh, hang on. No, still don't have any more questions. I will commend the book to you, not for this year's Christmas list, but for next year's Christmas list. And hopefully there will be open days at the excavations next summer. So again, I will commend those to you and pass back to Harvey to close the evening.
Okay, thank you very much, Jane. And Martin, thanks again. It was a very illuminating talk, I thought. I mean, one point that did strike me, of course, was the fairly traditional thing that if you stood in the way of Henry VIII's interests, you had problems. And I mean, Lovell had a huge assemblage of staff, at least it's reported, and it looks like his successor, Rutland, obviously still had the place under very good order, enough to ensure that Henry VIII decided he would take it over and return it for sites we couldn't really refuse. And I thought the other thing that was that struck me too was if this demolition took place at around 1660, of course it's just at the time of the return of King James's grandson, and we know that Charles II was quite a builder in terms of his royal palaces elsewhere, and quite a landscape designer too, or quite a landscape creator. Maybe one of the ways was getting rid of other properties. It's amazing to me how it just disappeared.
Well, it had already been sold off. It had already been sold off to the Earl of Montgomery, who had been allowed to live there for a long time. So on the eve of the English Civil War, it's sold to him. But we don't think he uses it hardly at all, because at that point, he's got sort of about 4 other very nice homes to live in. And it seems to go into a decline, but the documentary evidence suggests that what becomes important are the gardens around the palace. And they may even have a role to play in the story of the development of water gardens in Britain. 2 or 3 of the people associated with the palace were pioneers of important water gardens. And so at some point in the future, what we hope to do is to do some further work on those ponds that I mentioned early on in the talk, which may well be the remnants of important water gardens. But obviously it's a big site and there's a lot to do there.
Okay, well, look, thank you. Thanks very much for that, Martin. And I mean, of course, there may be many North Londoners who are here tonight, and I'm sure Enfield Archaeological Society could do with members. So anyone in the area who is interested, do consider joining it. The Society also publishes a very good series of newsletters regularly, which are excellent not only on archaeology, but on the local history of the Enfield area. And there are a lot of illuminating articles appear there. And I will just make a plug for Lammas too before we go. Those of you who are here tonight who are not members of Lammas, if you'd like to consider joining us, please do. I mean, our activities are very wide. Our publications are wide. We need membership for support of archaeology and local history in London. So do also, if you're not a member, do please consider joining us and have a look at our website as well as Martin's. So Martin, finally, thank you, and to all your colleagues who contributed to this work. It's quite a discovery to be able to see so much of even that area of that large palatial complex. So I'll thank you and wish you well, and wish everybody else well too. So I think that ends it. Jane, if you have any final points?
No, nothing to say. Thank you for concluding it nicely, and thank you for all the nice comments that we have in the chat. Thanking Martin for his excellent talk. Great. Okay, well, thank you. And shall we close it there? I see Louisa. Louisa's nodding to that. So thank you, and thanks everybody, and good night. Yep. Good night, everyone.